Welcome, everyone. I'm going to use the don't worry, I won't be this loud the whole time. Okay. All right. Well, there are a couple of seats left in the front. I would encourage anyone who's outside who would like to be closer to the action or would like a seat to come into the front. My name is Mariko Silver. I'm the president of Bennington College, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Frost House, or should I say for many of you, back to the Frost House. So I want to say a few thank yous, but really to say a few words about how thrilled the college is to be the steward of this extraordinary place. When friends of Robert Frost, and especially Carol Thompson, who I want to say a special thank you to, started talking with us about the possibility of partnering to take care of and steward and bring to the world the Frost House, we could hardly contain our excitement. The idea of reconnecting Frost with Bennington College was just so thrilling. So as some of you may know, Frost himself was very much in conversation with the founders of the college. He talked regularly to the president at the time about faculty whom he ought and probably ought not hire, if I had to guess. The oughts are in the record, the ought-nots not so much. But if I had to guess from what little I know about Frost, he had some real and clear opinions about who ought to be teaching at Bennington. And he was enormously supportive of the overall project, although I think he worried a little bit about Bennington girls tromping on his lawn, but never mind. I hope, or I like to think, that he would be thrilled today to see Bennington students realizing so many of the things that he envisioned, even at the time for this house and were he alive today, might continue to envision. Those of you who went on the, what did he call it, botanizing walks? Botanizing walk would probably like to know, if Sophie didn't tell you, that that was one of Frost's visions for this place. Right? The planting of heritage trees and plants, the real thinking about the relationship to the land, and frankly encouraging others, though of course it wasn't a museum at the time, it was his home, his family home, encouraging others to think about the relationship to the land and the relationship between the human-land interaction and what it is to be American and what it is to be of this place or in this place, what it is to have an American experience, whether you are American or not. And it's very exciting to think about Bennington College and Bennington College students continuing to help realize that vision, while at the same time interrogating the legacy of Frost himself in Frost's own inquiring spirit. And you're going to hear a little bit today from people who know a lot more about Frost than I do. But I want to say a couple of thank yous before we get there. I want to say a thank you, of course, to Carol Thompson and the dedicated board of the Friends of Robert Frost. I want to say a thank you to Meg Campbell, who I think is outside. She's right outside the screen. There you are. With the Preservation Trust of Vermont, whose support made the creation of the Frost House in this iteration possible. And of course to Peter Gilbert, here with us from Montpelier, who has led the Vermont Humanities Council for 16 years, a model to us all, and who serves as Frost's literary executor. Thank you for being here today. So you've heard a little bit about what students have been and will be doing. I had the pleasure of meeting today with one of my advisees who took Megan Mayhew Bergman's Digital Frost course this past term. It was fall, yeah? Mm-hmm. This past term. And she was raving about the experience of building a virtual and tactile experience for the visitors to the Frost House and even those who maybe can't get here in person, right? To project out into the world the possibilities that this house creates for writers and thinkers, for makers of all kinds. So I hope that you will take the time to look at the Lanke's exhibition in the house, the sculpture display in the big barn, the 3D photogrammetry images of the grounds and Frost's desk objects, that rolls right off the tongue, and to enjoy, as some of you did, I saw when I came here a little bit earlier, the guided tour of the plant life on the grounds. Students have been involved in every aspect of the project in the true Bennington College way. So I really want to say, too, how much we look forward to the events that are to come. Whether it's a collaboration with our MFA in Writing program, our literary journal, the Bennington Review, Poetry at Bennington, a longtime residency series that brings award-winning poets to campus for readings. And those of you who are poetry aficionados should know that Ross Gay, who is our last poet of the season, will be coming to the college on May 16th, and all of those events are open to the public. So with that, I would like to say a thank you to this entire community. It was thrilling, too, to see so many cars parked. We might have to work on having more parking. so many crowds like, oh, they're all on the lawn. I guess I should park on the lawn too. And I'd like to hand it over to Peter Gilbert to tell us a little bit more about Frost and his legacy.
Well, thank you, President Silver, and thanks to all of you for being. Look at all those people in the back. We've got a large crowd. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I've been asked to talk a little about why it's important to continue to read and talk about Robert Frost and his work, and why it's important that Bennington College is taking this house forward. It's important to continue to read Frost first and foremost because Frost is generally considered by academics and poets as to be at least one of the greatest several American poets. It's hard to overstate Frost's stature, and the fact that he's so popular, sometimes that gets lost. And one should always read the best poetry you can find, including his and that of many other poets as well, of course. One should read Frost for the same reason that one should read the poetry of any great poet, because there's much to learn from it about how to deal with the timeless issues of the human condition, including, to name just 3 prominent themes that you see in a lot of Frost's work: how to deal with grief and loss, the obligation we as individuals have to others, and the unavoidable fleetingness of life, of things that are gold, valuable, and loved, for example. His poetry, like all great literature, enlarges us as human beings and deepens our relation to life. And as with all great poetry, reading and rereading Frost reveals new reasons to admire his work. I heard some years ago Donald Hall, the poet and writer, talk about Frost. And he said, I thought for years that Frost had maybe 65 masterpieces. But then I keep discovering another one, and another one, right there in the book in front of me. So rereading and thinking about it again bears good fruit. In that case, he was thinking about a poem called The Draft Horse, which is an incredibly powerful, dark poem. We need to continue to wrestle with Frost and his work because in some ways I think we need to unlearn some of the things we think we know about Frost and Frost's poetry. Biographies published in the last 15 years or so give us a far more balanced, accurate portrait of the man than some people may have now. I'd mention in particular the biography written by Middlebury professor Jay Perini. And new scholarship helps us unlearn and learn about Frost. The multi-volume complete letters of Robert Frost that Harvard University Press is in the midst of publishing now affords people an opportunity to read Frost's works themselves for themselves. The letters enable us to see Frost more clearly, more directly, and you'll see in his letters, among other things, his genius. There are 2 volumes out. The third one should be out later this year, and then 2 more after that. It's anticipated that it'll be a 5-volume book. The authors who worked on it, the editors who've been putting it together, are right when they said to me some years ago, and I said, complete letters? I mean, complete letters? He said, Frost didn't write any boring letters. And pick it up and you'll discover that's the case. They're really quite wonderful. As part of Bennington College, the stone house, with its connection to the great poet, can inspire students and others to strive for the best writing and the best creating, the best art they're capable of. Frost's story reminds us of the importance of tenacity. Frost was committed and worked to be a poet since high school, but his first book was published when he was 40, and then he became an instant success after 25 years of hard work. Then several books followed shortly thereafter, and national attention and acclaim followed very quickly. Finally, this place is important because it was important to Frost. It was the haven that to which he returned from traveling around the United States, talking on many campuses and elsewhere to standing room only audiences, hundreds of them. He called it barding around. He was always a physically fragile man, but particularly in the 20s and the 30s, he was disposed to illness, to colds, to the flu, to coughs, to fevers, and it frequently interfered with his work and his schedule, his travel. And so it was always here that he came back to. Bennington students and others may find this place not only a source of inspiration and creativity, but also a place of renewal. Whereas Frost wrote, one can withdraw into oneself and store strength and gather inspiration so that one is somebody when he or she comes out again among people. Obviously, this place should not be a place that you go to avoid problems any more than college or the world of poetry should be. But it can be a place that renews one and makes one more able to confront the challenges and opportunities in life as it did for Robert Frost. Thanks very much.
Hello, I'm Mark Wonderlic, and I'm the director of the Bennington Writing Seminars, the graduate writing program at the college. And for the past 15 years, I've been a member of the literature faculty here, teaching poetry. So I'm very delighted to help open the season here at the Robert Frost Stonehouse Museum. And I'm happy that Bennington College now has the opportunity to attend to and foster its own literary landmark. Frost wrote some of his most well-known poems while living here, but the house itself isn't going to tell you much about them. Like all good poems, the poems Robert Frost wrote here were complex individual works of art, and they were born out of the poet's imagination and not out of the house in which he lived. Houses are, after all, quite literal. What we do see, however, in the landscape and the farms of this corner of Vermont are the images that he sought to describe, and a part of New England that has offered up the set pieces that allowed him to play out his own irreligious fantasies about a New England that may or may not have existed as he imagined them. Frost is both a figure of tradition and of innovation, of bitter nostalgia and an abiding formal rigor. Robert Frost was present for some of the first discussions around the founding of Bennington College. He lived for some time on the campus itself in a house called Shingle, which is used as student housing. And it was his idea, or so the story tells us, to have teachers at the college write narrative evaluations of their students rather than to assign them letter grades. That instinct to liberate students from letter grades in order to create room for the work itself, that is Robert Frost at his best, as he thought about the future of women's education, which of course it was at that time. I will also add that in my 15 years of teaching at Bennington College, I have written approximately 1,775 narrative evaluations, which is more than I have written of any other single genre of writing, period. We have Robert Frost, or I do particularly, to thank or to blame for that fact. I'll end with what is one of the most remarkable and well-known quotes from Frost's 1939 essay, The Figure a Poem Makes. And if you don't know this essay, it is one of the most fantastic pieces of writing about the writing of poetry that you can find. It's just absolutely terrific. It's a quote about how a poem is a proposition having to do with time, that contains also the contradictory impulse to create and to unmake. Like a piece of ice on a hot stove, the poem must ride on its own melting. Thanks.
Good afternoon. So I'm happy to see you here, and I want to start by proclaiming I never meant to be a Frost enthusiast. That was not in my life plan. So I'm really intrigued by the way he's found his way into my life. So I'm here first as a member of the Bennington College community, but also as a community member. So my husband's family has lived in Shaftsbury for almost 40 years, 2 miles down the road. And I was reading one of Frost's letters in February, and he said, "In February, do not ask me the names of my enemies or my friends." And I related to that so much in February. When I think about the best iteration of what this place can become, so no one will ever tell you that running a historic house museum for a dead white author is a great lucrative plan right now. I mean, it's not. But what's magical is the community that can grow up around it and what can flourish alongside of it. So I think of my job as a way of making really fascinating Venn diagrams between the Bennington College community and the Vermont community and local communities. So that is my job. And if you have ideas in that area, please bring them to me and let's have a conversation. We're going to have yoga classes in the barn, sculpture shows. We'll continue to have rigorous talks with Frost. And in fact, when I was researching Stephen Metcalf, who's going to be talking for us, he had this great line about interrogating Frost, and that Frost has stood up to criticism for so long, and he will continue to stand up to criticism. And I think that pairs well with the inquisitive Bennington nature, so expect plenty of that. I want to ask for your involvement in this project in any way that seems natural and fitting for you. We've got a lot of work to do on the grounds. When you walk outside, you are literally walking along stone walls, fallen birches, apple trees, actual physical objects, some of them in some state of disrepair, that relate directly to some of America's best known poems. And we have a chance to preserve those. We have a chance to make this a space where poetry and the arts are accessible and not precious. And as someone who grew up in a really poor rural community and used arts as a lifeline, that's very important to me. So I really anticipate that as being a sort of important aspect of this project. When Frost wrote about the 3 tenets of his life, he said they were teaching, farming, and poetry. And I think that well represents Bennington College, Shaftsbury, and what this museum can become. So I appreciate your involvement as members and donors and citizens, and thank you for being here. I want to take some time to introduce Stephen Metcalf, who's here to speak with us today about Frost and this idea of the rural authentic, which is so integral to our understanding and reading of Frost. So Stephen himself is a critic, an essayist, a podcaster. He's written for the New York Times, Slate, The Guardian, Atlantic, The New Yorker, and he started Slate's Culture Gabfest. And we're going to turn it over for him to give a lecture, and there'll be room for questions at the end. And again, thank you for showing up today. I appreciate it.
Is this in Frost's own handwriting? Do not move the podium. What happens when you move the podium? Does the Witch of Goas jump out of the woodwork. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I want to begin by saying that this was circled on the calendar for me before I was born. Robert Frost is a sacred touchstone for me. He may be standing up to criticism stoutly, but none from me, really. Nonetheless, this won't be a total hagiography. I had put off reading what was the standard biography of Frost, which has been, I think we can be grateful for it having been made somewhat obsolete by the recent contributions by J. Perini. But supposedly Frost was something of a difficult, complex, and in some regards wretched human being. And I worshipped his poetry so much I didn't want to find out the details of it. Well, I had made a mistake because even taking the standard biography by Thompson with a grain of salt, one discovers one of the extraordinary lives of the late 19th, let me put it in some perspective. Frost was born the same year that Thomas Hardy published Far From the Madding Crowd, and died the same year that Bob Dylan came out with Freewheelin'. His poems about rural life became the most popular American poems during a period in which farming disappeared as a common way of life in the United States. And yet Frost hated the idea that he was a rural sentimentalist. He had another reason, I think, to admire him. He hated E.A. Robinson, a hugely successful contemporary, probably in part because Robinson was hugely successful. But mostly because Robinson was working, as Frost saw it, superficially in the same vein. I don't want to be called a farmer, Frost spat. Robinson spoiled farming for me. The whole damn thing became disgusting in his romantic mouth. So if you really want to insult the ghost of Robert Frost, turn him into a rural sentimentalist. I'm going to try to avoid doing that in what follows. But I'm very curious about the meaning of the word rural, because as we all know, it's become a contested and somewhat politicized term in America, especially over the last 5 years, but certainly since the recent election. What follows is not a political discourse, so we can all relax. But nonetheless, I was drawn to his biography because the word is troubled. He was such an unlikely ruralist. It's one of the things I love about Frost. Nothing in his life appears to me to be the slightest bit inevitable. I mean, only with a kind of hagiographic hindsight does it suddenly seem inevitable that he became Frost. He was born spent his early childhood in San Francisco. He heard voices as a young boy. They terrified him, and he had a lifelong fear of being alone. After his ne'er-do-well father died, his family was moved back east, and at 12, this also floored me, he began to work in a factory to make extra money for the family. He was what's called a bobbin boy, and he replaced the burnt-out filaments in arc lamps. He discovered on the roof of the main building a small structure built to house a large belt wheel, and there he read and he slept. These were the Arlington Mills, and we're talking now 1893, 1894. So the height of the Gilded Age, the closing of the frontier, the rise of modern Wall Street, very unfrostian things are happening in American life. And here he is as a young man working in a factory, and he hates it. And he finds a way to hide and to hide out within it. And there he reads Shakespeare, and he begins to admire the relationship between metrical rhythm and the intonations of speech and meaning. Which is to say that perched in this henhouse-like structure on the top of the Gilded Age factory, he began to find his vocation as a poet. And he began to think about the sound, what he called the sound of talk, conveying the sound of talk. In other words, informal speech in a formally constructed literary artifact. This was so important to Frost that he developed his theory of poetry on top of it, in which words were meaningless relative to sound and rhythm. And this is a wonderful image from Frost, like two people talking on opposite sides of a closed door. In conversation, sense is carried by something other than the precise words being chosen. Formal metrical rhythm and the natural rhythms and cadences and intonations of conversational speech. In a sense, Frost spent the rest of his life bringing those two things together, as I think in some ways no other poet ever did. So what's the relationship between that, his poetic vocation, and the vocation of farming? He came to farming first through his experience of literary genre. The eclogues of Virgil were used as an antidote to his bouts of nervous fatigue. His doctor had prescribed farming as a possible cure for his stomach pains, chest pains, insomnia. The extent of his hypochondria really floored me. I didn't know that he was a sort of nervously fragile human being. But a lot of things get explained once you know that about him. He took up chicken farming because he thought it would be easy. He did not enter farming with a romantic notion of it at all. He bought a farm in Derry, New Hampshire, or rather, and this I think is very important, his grandfather bought it for him. His first serious attempt at farming was bound up with the question of whether he should continue living, a question that he'd studied at Harvard, that's sort of a joke, under the influence of William James. Though not with James directly, he lost out on that possibility when James was away, so he studied with Santayana, James's cosmopolitan colleague. But he felt it deeply as a real problem. He was essentially suicidal. He had lost a child, his own child, to what he saw as his own negligence, and life became very dark for him. But spring on the farm convinced him to live, at least more than Harvard did. His first spring on the farm in Derry. And then that summer, his grandfather died and left him the farm for 10 years to use, and then after 10 to own outright, along with the annuity from it for the rest of his life. So farming for Frost was literary, it was medicinal, and it was also a bequest. More, I think, than it was work. And for Frost, it was never necessary work, that is, work to survive. With the further irony, he was a bad, and in his own description, often very derelict farmer. I kept farm, so to speak, for nearly 10 years, but less as a farmer than as a fugitive from the world that seemed to disallow me. Have we heard that quote already tonight? Possibly. Well, it's even better the second time. It was all instinctive, but I can see now that I went away to save myself and fix myself before I measured my strength against all creation. He did see enough of farming to understand rural isolation, rural poverty, and how brutally hard the work was. And so his poetry contained within it an actual memory of life before widespread mechanization and mass media. And he found real poetry in it, that feeling of rural isolation verging on serious claustrophobia in his poems, I think, is very real. I mean, you hear it. You hear years spent in the dark on a farm at night with the same 3, 4, 5 people. We think of Frost naturally, I think, as the poet of taciturn New England. I mean, some of his more well-known lines and characters speak in that mode. But he's also the poet of how people speak to break what would otherwise be a dead or intolerable silence. I mean, so many of those early poems are dialogues that go on for pages and pages. They're so voluble, and they're not thought about enough. I think they're just remarkable, dramatic performances on his part. And he obviously learned the rhythms of New England speech, of people talking at length, often to avoid saying anything. It's not good that people are all nodding out there on the lawn. Yeah. Familiar with that phenomenon. He learned how to take that lonely conversational speech pattern and string it out along metrical lines. I mean, I think that's just distinctively his genius, so that it somehow lost neither the music of poetry nor the informality of actual speech. And so he found a way to turn vernacular American into an ancient language. When he ditched that farm in Derry in 1911, it came as a relief to do so. And farming then began to assume the status in his life of something of a personal myth. Sorry. And he continued his quest looking for what I would call a truly radical apartness. I feel like we skipped a page in there. No, apparently not. All right, keep going. The lonely apprenticeship of becoming Robert Frost. And bear in mind now, he's 36 or 37 years old, touched on this earlier. The remarkable length of self-apprenticeship apart from the literary marketplace is really almost unique. I mean, there are many people of whom it's true, but of his stature, I think it's very unusual. And he did something that I found most remarkable. In fact, what follows, I think, is in some ways the most astonishing part of his biography. He moves his family to England. It kind of inexplicably. I mean, I know of no, one can guess and extrapolate and project upon it like a Rorschach blot, but it's kind of unclear what kind of a strategic move this was. He moves his family to England, where he could be both radically apart and romantically homesick for New England. And after a decade spent on a lonely farm in New Hampshire, staring at the night sky, botanizing, I love that word too, and performing chicken husbandry, a decade of loneliness and vocational embarrassment in many ways, broken only by some school teaching, which he was very, very good at, he'd created, though he probably did not know he was doing it at the time, a kind of treasury to call upon for the rest of his life. A treasury of loneliness, recrimination, claustrophobia, to go with apple orchards and west running brooks and the sound of trees. And more or less, secretly, he had put this all into sound and sense, into poetry. He brings poems with him to England. I think that's part of why he goes. He's so incredibly vulnerable in the face of bringing his literary wares to market. Somehow that distance and that apartness was essential to him psychologically to be able to do it. And so all of a sudden, I urge you to, if you've never read a biography of Frost, this portion of his life is just remarkable because he essentially goes from being, kind of a nobody, a rural nobody, to meeting Ezra Pound and Yeats and them greeting him as a outsider genius ready to make literary history. And overnight is almost not an exaggeration. Very quickly, all of a sudden, the strange, volatile, socially disconnected but arrogant Rube, and I say that lovingly, ill-formed, ill-socialized, oddly mannered, affecting the speech patterns of backcountry New Hampshire by botanizing, raking leaves, reading Virgil, thinking through all the suicides he had not committed, approaching his late 30s with no connections, contacts, prospects whatsoever. After a long delay, almost overnight, he enters literary history. Very quickly, Ezra Pound gets a hold of a copy of A Boy's Will, and he knows he's onto something remarkable, something new, unique, and totally original. And he writes to Harriet Monroe, this is Ezra Pound, and says, "This is a scoop, for I only found the man by accident." And very quickly, Frost is a success not only as a poet, but as a persona, as a performer. He begins to perform his selfhood for the marketplace. And he begins retailing this person that he'd created in extended isolation in New Hampshire. That is, he begins bringing it to market. He began to dare to say it out loud. What he wanted was success. He didn't want to be like Pound, to have success of the coterie, the critical few, but with the public. I want to be a poet for all sorts and kinds, he said. By his fourth book, New Hampshire, he had a conscious philosophy of selling. It was good. And only an archaic or self-serving form of snobbery would array against it. Gentlemen and communists were united in their haughty opposition to commercial life. By New Hampshire, he was a legitimate star. He'd conquered the market on his terms, and to his credit, he was not going to pretend that he was just some charming pumpkin. I love that he wrote his poem New Hampshire in Vermont. That is so Frost. That distance, right? Anyway, as we know, he wrote the poem New Hampshire right here. He wrote it in an all-nighter, scarcely conscious of what he was doing. Getting onto the page, a cutting irony about the snobbery of being above selling and trade. He only realizes he's done this when he sees the first hint that he's taken an all-nighter and completed the poem, when he sees the first hint of dawn and now I need help. Hitting the syringa tree? Oh, let's say syringa. A lilac. He sees it hitting a lilac. Why use an ordinary word when you can use a fancy one? That's very unfrost, but very me, unfortunately. And do you know what he does next? I bet many people in this crowd do. He's purged this poem about selling and you shouldn't be above the marketplace and on and on and on. He returns to his desk and what does he write? Stopping by the woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods are these? I think I know. Some of the most famous and most infamously commodified words in the English language. So how did he balance farming, which represented apartness from the market, with this market success? An apprenticeship in self-doubt, a pure affair of aesthetic conscience at least, and the commodified word, and soon enough, or already I think, the commodified self. How did he strike his balance, and I would argue a necessary balance between these two things? The truth is he wrote and lectured about this very subject quite a lot. It fascinated him. I think a person has to be withdrawn into himself or gather inspiration so that he is somebody when he comes out again among folks, when he comes to market with himself, Frost's phrase. He learned that he's got to be almost wastefully alone. Or another quote, "There is always and there will always be many lots of land left out in the system. I dedicate these lots to the stray souls who from incohesiveness feel rarely the need of the forum for their thoughts, of the market for their wares and produce." Refuse to be rushed to market or forum. Don't come as a product till you have turned yourself under many times. Praise be to the unconsidered land. I think here we're getting at the function land, rural work, owning a farm, played in his literary vocation as it connects maybe to the political identity of Americans. Farming had afforded Frost a high degree of privacy, waywardness, anti-sociability, eccentricity, arrogance, in order to undertake a very long project with very uncertain ends. The ultimate risk that you are nothing but a fool, and nothing but the fool that people say you are, that your arrogance is unconnected and will stay unconnected to any tangible achievement, that you are going to spend your life a ridiculous mooncalf, that you are willing to take that risk to create a self apart from the market that you can then bring to market and triumph with. Farming allowed him more, I think more than anything, certainly more than England, and anyway, to be apart and to continue being apart as he had been reading Shakespeare in the mill long enough to make this singular creature we now all know and I believe all love, known as Robert Frost. So by his fourth book, he's a success. Robert Frost, The Creation of Derry, New Hampshire, has been taken to market and prized highly. But Frost's success coincided with something else. In 1900, when Frost began to farm, 41% of the American workforce was employed in agriculture. When he died, it was closer to 4%. It's now approaching 1%. Whatever else is true, it's hard to argue that rural still signals an agricultural way of life. It had become obvious to anyone who cared to notice by the 1930s that the family farm, the small farm, was a badly decaying American institution, being displaced by industrial agriculture. And this obviously hit Frost where he lived, but it hit him in a very particular way, I think. He was so unwilling to give up anything by way of his cherished ideal of apartness. And so he hated the New Deal, and he blamed the fate of the American family farm on the New Deal. He blamed mechanization not on free enterprise, not on untrammeled capital, but on the socialistic tendencies of the New Deal. He said the socialist means to abolish the farmer by driving him to work in the cities. And he very much personalized this to FDR, who he detested. The president is up to this, he said. He wrote a pastoral poem directly echoing Virgil, in which his alter ego, Tityrus, I'm probably mispronouncing that, says, this is one of my favorite lines in all of Robert Frost. It's going to be an epigraph to a book that's taken me decades to write, so how perfect, right? To market 'tis our destiny to go, but much as in the end we bring for sale there is still more we never bring or should bring. What a remarkable concision, right? There's a depth of thought and commitment to so few words. And then he added to it, I bid you to a one-man revolution, the only revolution that is coming. He got into a very funny back and forth by letter with a family friend, a friend who admired FDR, who said, if any large proportion of farmers took the advice given in this poem he had written, this kind of eclogue, Virgilian poem, and dug in and ate and wore their own products and didn't go to market to buy and sell more than a little dribble of excess, city people and Easterners, including poets and homilizers, would pretty quickly be starved out by the millions. It's a fascinating exchange of letters. So here we arrive at the rub, at least as I'd like to present it tentatively now. In Frost, I'd argue we have an exemplar of a non-negotiable ideal of creative individuality as safeguarded by his apartness or our apartness, should we choose to pursue something like it. But we also have a political notion of individuality that makes it very hard for us to abridge the market and to defend those ways of life that allow us the creative individuality as it flourished so beautifully in Robert Frost. What are the effects of this mythology of apartness as it turns into a different kind of individuality on farming that is supposedly its unique source. The process of vertical integration of food production in this country has resulted in 10 of the largest US-based multinational corporations accounting for half of the food and beverage sales in the United States. I think this lesson serves to remind us that though we often think of American history as the westward movement of people, it's also the history of commodities and commodity pricing sweeping eastward. Once a national market for goods had consolidated, it was inevitable that prices for agricultural commodities would be set by large, mechanized industrial farms, and that with prices so set, industrial efficiency would sweep eastward through the pioneer farms of the Midwest homesteaders, right up to the self-sufficient farms of the Northwest, destroying Frost's cherished way of life and eradicating the basis for his own cherished apartness. So I think we can see how we've ended up somewhat stranded now when it comes to the word rural in this country, because it connotes two very radically opposed notions of authenticity. The rural person who's authentic simply for being a negation of the will or prerogatives of cosmopolitan elites, and the cosmopolitan elitist who returns to the land looking to escape the logic of global information and capital, all the things we feel overwhelmed by, in hopes of a Frost-like sense of creative autonomy. And this is very true where I live. I live in the Hudson Valley. And even as my wife and I, who've moved there as refugees from Brooklyn, say the word rural, words like rural and authentic, we stare across a kind of moral and political chasm at the people who have lived in this community, often for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think this is a shame, but I think Frost may hold out some possibility of hope for bridging this chasm. Because Frost came up with a creative détente with the market, and he forged it here in New Hampshire and on these very grounds, where he struck a balance between his sacred apartness and the market, to which he brought his remarkable and enduring harvest. In that harvest, I think the hope is still held out that we might find the rhythms of a common American speech, regardless of the precise sense of the particular words we may be choosing as we stand on opposite sides of a common door. I'll conclude only by saying, where better to hope that hope than here at the Stonehouse and here in the state of Vermont. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. That's very kind of you. Does anyone have a question? We can Q&A or not. Oh, everyone wants beer. That's great. All right, thanks for listening.